So welcome everyone to our August virtual learning session for the NARUC-NASEO Initiative on Comprehensive Planning in an Era of Load Growth. I hope you're all having a good summer, but we're excited today to talk about transmission planning models, tools, and assumptions. If you recall, that's the second in our kind of three-part virtual learning section on looking at distribution planning and transmission planning and generation planning. So we did already do distribution planning, and now we're switching over to transmission planning, and we're very excited to have David Sehloff join us from Argonne National Lab to lead us through that. So once we are finished with the welcome and the agenda overview, which I'm doing right now, I'll turn it over to Danielle to introduce him. And we've broken this up just like we did last time in sort of two sections. So we'll have the first part on scenario development with David, and then we have an opportunity for some Q&A. And then we will hear from him again, and then specifically about part two, the needs identification and selection. And then just like we always do, we will break out in small group discussions with our trusted whiteboards to kind of think about where you are all having challenges and what other states may have for resources for all of you on these topics that we're discussing today. And then we'll just reconvene and then break at 4:30 p.m. Eastern. And I think with that, next slide, please. Yeah, before I turn it over to Danielle, I wanted to also just quickly do two announcements. One is that the third installment of our planning series in the virtual learning sessions will be on September 2nd at 3 p.m. Eastern, again, 3 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Eastern, and you'll see kind of the same format, and this will be on integrated resource planning. We will also send you another email before that as a reminder, but if you have any questions that you are already thinking of when it comes to integrated resource planning, feel free to share those with Danielle or myself, and then we'll make sure that the experts will have that. And then we also wanted to highlight a webinar from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab on coordinating DER interconnection and grid planning on August 21st, and from 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern. And Jessica just dropped the link in the chat for the registration. So feel free to join that. That should also be really, really interesting and pertinent to our topics that we're covering through this virtual learning series. And with that, I will turn it over to Danielle to introduce David Sehloff.
Perfect. Thanks, Kirsten. Welcome, everybody. Great to have you here this August day. I'm going to swap out our screen sharing with Jessica while I introduce David. Thank you, David, for coming to join us today and provide an expert perspective on transmission. David is an energy systems engineer in infrastructure systems modeling at Argonne National Lab. He has a PhD, a master's, and a bachelor's in electrical engineering and system science and computer engineering. And recently, he's been providing a lot of support to states that are working through their 1920 compliance options, including specifically the PJM Area Relevant State Entities Committee, or PARSEC. And we are grateful that he is able to adapt his work on that, speaking to many utility commissions, to all of us, and talk to us about transmission planning, modeling, and tools and assumptions based on the questions that you provided to us earlier this spring. So David is going to give the first half of his presentation right now, and then we'll do Q&A, as Kirsten said, and then we'll go to the second half. And he is joined by Todd Levin, who's also at Argonne National Lab, who will help us in our expert breakouts later. So David, I believe you're up. Please take it away.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Danielle, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all. I'm really grateful for this, and especially after having the chance to work with a few of the familiar names that I see who are involved in the PARSEC. That's been work supported by the DOE Grid Deployment Office, and that we developed some of the material that you'll see here as part of some learning sessions there, and looking forward to sharing it with you all. Next slide, please. The purpose of this talk is really to give a high-level overview of a lot of the modeling practices and tools and assumptions that we make in transmission planning. Really, it is to answer the question, what are the major modeling pieces?
Please go ahead. I think we got the audio taken care of.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So what are the major modeling pieces and how do they fit together? As needed, we'll cover some of the context in which these models are used and touch on relevant policies, but the focus is really on the modeling and on the tools. We don't assume a technical background in power system planning, and so the content here is at a higher level. As mentioned, we have two parts, and we'll have time for Q&A after each one. So please hold any questions till the end of each session. Next slide, please. So transmission planning is a very challenging look into the future. Without knowledge of what a power system will look like 5, 10, or 20 years into the future, we have to make assumptions. And then on top of those assumptions, we have to build very complex models and do very detailed analyses. So incorrect assumptions can lead to inefficient investment decisions, and regrets will happen. That's part of transmission planning. And one of the main goals of transmission planning is to minimize those regrets in the investments that we make. So more specifically, the modeling is very complex because it involves interaction of physics at time scales going down to microseconds with economics at scales going up to decades. The investments that are involved are quite large. They need to be planned years in advance, and they will last a very long time. At each time scale involved, there is a high degree of uncertainty. It's coming from things like weather, from things like demand at very short time scales, demand at very long time scales, large loads that might come in. That's been a topic that we've discussed in the past months. And also the interdependencies are very strong. So the transmission needs are driven very strongly by generation and by distribution systems. But the transmission system also has a very strong influence on what happens in the generation and distribution systems. So that influence flows in both directions. We have these separate planning processes that very strongly influence each other. And that's just within electric power. There are also significant interdependencies with other infrastructures, gas, water, telecommunications, many other things. These are just the modeling challenges, just a few of them. We're not going to touch on the challenges of making sure that everyone at the table is happy with the outcomes. I would say that's maybe much harder than any of the modeling questions that we're going to touch on. But we'll focus on the modeling here. Next slide, please. Besides the challenges of the modeling, there are also multiple objectives that need to be satisfied. So reliability is really at the core of transmission planning. That's always been the main driver that underpins all of transmission planning practice and policy. And that includes the most recent developments, like FERC Order 1920. Reliability is really at the core of that. But we also want to consider economics, and that was made explicit in FERC Order 890, which is another major landmark transmission planning order. in 2007, it required a consideration of economic efficiency of the network, that planners would identify any significant and recurring types of congestion. Congestion is what creates price differences throughout a network, and so it's important to be able to identify any persistent causes of that, and that was made explicit there. Public policy is also another important one that was defined in FERC Order 1000 in 2011, that there's a requirement to consider the transmission needs driven by public policy requirements established by state or federal laws or regulations. So this is something that's needed as an input to the analysis. Now, these are often thought about as three separate siloed planning processes. They don't have to be that way. Public policy is really an input that can and should go into reliability and economic models, and the reliability and economic models do have their own analysis that's required to consider each one, but we don't necessarily want them to be totally isolated from each other. There are it's important to consider all of the factors as much jointly as we can, which I think is one of the themes of this education series. Next slide, please. So that leads us into an outline of what our talk will focus on, and what the steps are in transmission planning, specifically the modeling part. So we first need to understand what the system will look like in the future, this 5, 15, 20 years into the future. And that's where policy does come in. And then we need to translate that future into a specific model or set of models that can be used for our analyses that are used to determine our needs. So those models go into our reliability analyses and our economic analyses. From there, we determine needs that come out. And then finally, there is a need to identify and evaluate the potential solutions to those needs. So this will be our outline for today. We'll focus the first session on scenario development, and then the next will be mainly on needs identification, and we'll briefly touch on solution evaluation as well. Next slide, please. And then next slide, yeah. Okay, so now we're getting into the first section on scenario development. Next slide, please. So just to orient us as we begin, this slide attempts to give context into the spatial and the time dimensions of transmission planning. Now, there are a variety of transmission planning processes. First, FERC Order 1000 is the main regional transmission planning order. And this specifically identified 11 planning regions. And each transmission owner in a region, or I should say, each FERC-governed transmission owner in a region needs to participate in this regional process. And also some coordination between regions. Now, the distinction that I would draw here between the ISO and RTO regions and the non-RTO regions would be that regions which have an ISO or RTO, that entity manages the planning process. So the ISO or the RTO leads this regional planning process. In non-RTO regions, there is a regional planning group that leads this. So, an example, in the Northwest Northern Grid or in the Southwest West Connect, this planning group has participation from the transmission owners in the region, and they participate in this regional planning process that is governed by Order 1000. Besides the Order 1000 regional transmission planning, individual transmission owners and this applies whether they are in an ISO RTO region or not, they will conduct their own local planning. And this is important for their own transmission system. May relate to regional or interregional needs, and in that case, it would be done in coordination with the larger regional entities. But it may be more local needs that bridge the gap between the regional transmission and the sub-transmission or distribution systems. So those different spatial scales and planning entities are important processes that are at work, whether they're governed by the FERC orders or not. And then this plays out in different time scales. So short-term planning involves looking at next 1 to 5 years, and this applies to both regional and local planning. Mid to long-term planning is really what's covered under Order 1000, and that looks at a 5 to 15-year time scale. And then long-term planning, which is under FERC Order 1920, clearly defines a period of 20 years. That is the scenario that goes into this transmission planning consideration as a 20-year horizon. So these are some of the different the contexts in which we see transmission planning, and that's important because it drives the types of decisions we make when we're constructing those scenarios. Next slide, please. So when we construct scenarios, we're really trying to get the best picture that we can of what the future might look like. And this involves some degree of estimates and gathering the best available information, and also making some decisions about uncertain variables. So some of the factors that go into this are known utility plans. Those are really best available information. Those are fairly concrete. Consumer procurement targets, public policy, and we're getting into a little bit more uncertainty here. Generation additions, generation retirements, fuel prices, demand, climate and weather conditions, and non-dispatchable generation profiles. These really all involve some combination of the best available information or estimates about that, and some translation of uncertainty into a concrete value. So we need to take all of those, which could take many different realizations, and condense those into concrete scenarios that are feasible for our analysis tasks. And in practice, this looks like 3 or less scenarios. So in regional planning under Order 1000, there's a degree of flexibility around scenarios. Many entities use a single scenario, some use 2 or 3, and those scenarios are 5 to 15 years in nature. Order 1920 is much more specific about this. There's a requirement to use 3 20-year scenarios. So what we're going to spend some time on in this section is how do we reduce all of these possible inputs into concrete values that are scenarios that we can use in our analysis. But the first question that we want to ask is, what actually is in one of these representative scenarios of future years? So next slide, please. So what is in a scenario? Basically, it includes all the data that we need to perform reliability and economic assessments. So this includes power flow data. This is the same data as what's filed under FERC 715 filings. It has the information about the connectivity of the transmission network, its topology, all of the transmission lines, overhead and underground, the the transformers, the buses, generators, and their output at a particular scenario time, and the demand at that time, including the ratings on all of those equipment and all of the engineering parameters needed to do studies. That's a lot of data, and it's challenging to build those models accurately. Reliability data is also needed. So some examples of this would be what contingencies are we going to analyze, and we'll talk more about that later. Some weather sensitivities or extreme weather events. Economic data is also needed. If we're going to do economic analysis, we need information including generator heat rates and fuel prices and things like that. So next, we're going to do a quick aside into what power flow models are. And so power flow models essentially say that given a certain generation and demands, how does the power flow through every line, transformer, and other element of the network between the generation and the load? We also call this power flow load flow. There are a variety of ways that this is represented, and transmission planning uses all four of these that you see here on this slide quite a bit. They have varying degrees of accuracy, and I won't get into a lot of detail about these, but it's useful to understand the limitations of each one and capabilities of it. So given this network here, where we have 500 megawatts of generation and 500 megawatts of demand, a copper plate model essentially ignores the transmission network. It assumes there are no losses and the transmission is unlimited. If we have this 500 megawatts that needs to get to the load, we say, sure, that it made it. There's no issue. This is useful for studies that look more at supply-demand balance and aren't considering transmission. The next level of complexity is the pipe and bubble model, or the transportation model, or network flow. This model looks at capacity constraints, but it ignores the physics of circuits and usually ignores losses. The next level of complexity is DC power flow, which includes those capacity constraints, and it has a linear approximation of the physics. It still ignores losses and ignores voltage magnitude. Finally, AC power flow is the most detailed. It models the capacity constraints and the full physics of steady state power flow. That includes transmission losses. And it's the only one shown here that includes the voltage and the reactive power. So if we're going to say anything about over voltage or under voltage or reactive power, we need to do an AC power flow study. So with that brief aside, we'll go to the next slide. And our next question is, how do we get from these inputs to these detailed scenarios of power flow characteristics, reliability, and economic features? Next slide. First, we define the input values and how we take those uncertainties into concrete values. And then step 2 would be capacity expansion modeling. And next slide, a persistent question that we have through all of this is, how do we reduce these uncertainties into concrete inputs? So we'll focus just briefly on a couple of these inputs. This won't be comprehensive. Next slide, please. The first one that we want to look at is demand. And I know that you've had a session on demand forecasting a couple of months ago, so I really won't go into much detail here. There are teams in each ISO and RTO that are really good at this. Data-driven approaches do well for short-term forecasting, but there are a lot of exogenous features that we need to incorporate for longer-term demands. There are a variety of temporal resolutions that are used. Often for long-term forecasts, we just get monthly or seasonal peak demand. But there are some examples of higher temporal resolution. So ERCOT, for example, has a long-term hourly forecast. And often this is typically done by load zone. So there will be a few load zones per state or per region. Next slide, please. I won't spend a lot of time on this again, but there are a lot of different components that go into these exogenous variables that create uncertainty in load forecasts and need to be included in a bottom-up approach that models each one of these potential sources of variability and uncertainty in the demand. Next slide, please. Finally, there are clear ways of handling uncertainty in load forecasts. So the forecast will include the representation of uncertainty and propagate it through the modeling. And then we need to translate these probabilistic models into a set of concrete scenarios to realize the underlying uncertainty. So as a quick example here, if we have heat and humidity as the uncertainties, we have what's called a 50-50 forecast, which is the load that we estimate under average heat and humidity. So there's a 50% chance that the load will exceed this forecast. Whereas a 90-10 forecast is a more extreme forecast with the 90th percentile heat and humidity. So this is capturing 90% of what we'd expect the load to possibly be. Next slide. The other feature that we're going to cover here as an input is the climate and weather dependency. So that there are some challenges here. How do we translate those weather variables into specific power system impacts? So load depends on temperature, humidity, the solar insolation. Generation depends on wind speed, solar insolation, temperature, humidity, the cooling water. Transmission can depend on temperature and wind speed. And then there can be extreme conditions and natural hazards to consider also. There's also a correlation across infrastructures, for example, between electric and gas that really should be captured in planning models. But that's very challenging. Next slide, please. There are a few sources of data that we can use for weather. One would be historic observations. These are real point measurements that are taken at weather stations, but this can be very difficult to apply in practice because we need to interpolate that data. It might be sparse, there might be missing data, and it might not have all the variables that we need. So this is where reanalysis comes in, and this is used quite a bit in future planning and modeling. This takes historic observations of weather, and it estimates the values of the variables at a uniform spatial and temporal scale. So ERA 5 has data from 1940 to present at an hourly resolution and a fairly fine scale grid. The issue is that it doesn't represent any future trends with climate. So that's where future climate simulations come in. So Argonne has a portal called Climber, and NREL, another national lab, has the NCDB. These use forecasts of future climate going into mid-century and end of century, and they're downscaled to have a high spatial resolution, and a lot of this data is freely available online. Next slide. So these features are then put into a capacity expansion model. And so we'll spend just a couple minutes talking about capacity expansion models. These models are optimization models that determine generation type, sizing, and siting, and when they would be installed. Input to this is the inputs that we've talked about, weather, future demand, and there are a lot of constraints that go into these models, and then we often take a least cost objective, but there can be other objectives, for policy goals or welfare and equity. These are all possible capacity expansion goals, but this is really aimed at estimating generation additions and retirements going into the future. Next slide, please. There are a lot of different features that we can consider in capacity expansion. I mentioned power flow models. There are a lot of different power flow models we can take in capacity expansion. Computation is a key constraint on these. And in the interest of time, I think I'll skip through this slide. So if we could go to the next slide. There are also different decisions we can make about representing generation and policy. And next slide, please. Finally, the capacity expansion models give us the ability to analyze different scenarios. So here's an example of looking at different policy scenarios, both in the impacts to operations and newly installed capacity. We can see how those policy inputs drove different outcomes in the generation, operations and installed capacity. Next slide, please. There are a lot of models that are used for this. So Plexos and Aurora are two, ProMod, PlanOS, and EFRI's EGS. Those are commercial grade tools. There are many research grade tools that are also used. Next slide, please. The last slide in this section before I break for Q&A is how we translate these capacity expansion models into specific models for reliability analysis and for economic analysis. So there are some challenges here. How do we go from a zonal model where generation was sited at a zonal level to putting the generators at specific points in the full power flow nodal model? Same thing for demand. How do we disaggregate that zonal demand forecast to a nodal model? And then just when we're developing these study cases, what are we going to consider? Do we want to do a summer peak, a winter peak, a shoulder season? All kinds of different realizations of this long-term planning model can show up as specific snapshot cases where we're looking at the reliability conditions. So it's challenging to pick the right conditions that we want to study the reliability for. There are some standards from NERC on this, and so planning entities have their own heuristics and approaches to address those. So we're ready to break for Q&A now. Go to the next slide.